Today's presentation is titled Find Works to Share, Reuse, or Remix, Creative Commons, Open Access, and Public Domain. If you'd like to view the slides, they are available at this bit.ly link, or you could also use your QR code reader to read them on your device. COSI in the library are often asked about using materials beyond textbooks for instructional purposes. You may have found web pages or chapters scanned and put on Google, and you're curious about if you could use those for your courses. Well, what I'm going to do today is describe the labels or types of work that are more flexible in terms of their use, and there's much fewer ambiguity and questions about them. So, today, the goals for this presentation will be to define Creative Commons, open access, and public domain, the labels that I just described, and then introduce and identify the terms of the use. I will list some best practices for using these types of works for your instruction and then give you some sources where you could locate these types of works. You can find materials with very few restrictions for your instruction. Creative Commons are things you've probably seen on web pages, books, or even documents, and usually it has like some sort of CC label followed by a series of letters and numbers. And these are licenses that allow reuse with terms attached. I'll explain what those mean. The second type of label I'll introduce is open access, and this is a publishing model that makes works freely available and often online. And then finally, we'll go into public domain, which are works without copyright protection. This could include books, images, even film, and other types of materials. I also wanted to say if you have questions, I will field you the questions after I'm done introducing Creative Commons, and then I could answer any questions you may have. And then towards the end, we'll have room for questions too, whether it's chat or you get unmuted. So the materials I described, Creative Commons, public domain, and open access work can be used for many things. For your teaching and instructional uses, you could use them as slides, exercises, and recordings. You could also get like a simulation on online too. Well, what that black box was a simulation of a plinko exercise. What you had on there was like a triangle with pegs, and you put in like a coin of some sort, and it just kind of randomly goes down the triangle into the bottom. And that's an exercise used by the Physics Interactive Simulations, which was an NSF sponsored program. It's one of many simulations it has to teach physics and physical science concepts. In this particular case, the Plinko game was to teach about the variance of probability. And then you do have a lot of professors who put their course cartridges online and let them be available. Some other examples is the College Success textbook that's available through OpenStax. It is a free open access book that's used a lot for first year freshmen or first year experience programs. It's available online and you could also print it out as well. Then, just to give you another example, there's a slide share called cross-referencing using MLA format. So if your students needed some tips about using MLA format or some sort of exercise to write their papers or do their assignments, there's lots of works that could be used and repurposed pretty readily for your class. Then, okay, I'm sorry that the slides misnumbered my numbers here, but Creative Commons public domain and open access materials can also be used as creative works. So if you need demonstrative images, sound, and more, you could also add that. We often get asked quite a bit if certain images can be used for PowerPoint slides. And to give you an example, we've got this picture of an immigrant family at Ellis Island. This is a public domain image, which means it has no copyright protection and it can be used freely and openly and on your slides or any other materials you may want to use. You could also reuse open access Creative Commons and public domain works for remixing and derivative uses. So, this is a newspaper clip that I got, assessing fair use, of course. And The Great Gatsby, the novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, had entered the public domain in 2021. So, what a lot of playwrights did was they made new interpretations and performances of this novel. the novel had aged out of its copyright protection in 2021. And so a lot of people were able to repurpose it. And in this case, I'm aware of multiple stage productions that reinterpreted The Great Gatsby using Black performers, or let's just say Jay Gatsby was Black instead, and how the theme would have been different, or how it would have been a little different from the original work. But this example I like to show is a way to add or change content. You could apply a public domain work to your creative work or your research, or you could even mix it to make your own course pack if you'd like to do that. The first thing I'll describe are Creative Commons. These are licenses that allow reuse with terms attached. So, what happens is a creator will add a Creative Commons license to their work. Now, they still hold the copyright, they still own the work. They don't necessarily just give away the work for any purpose whatsoever. Creative Commons licenses also have a variety of conditions that could be attached to a work, so that you can tell a person if they want to use, say, an image or some photographs that you had taken. I hold the copyright, but you can use it if you attribute me and you don't make derivatives, for instance. That's a type of license that could be attached to a Creative Common work. And the whole intent is really to allow people to reuse these kinds of work without permission and as long as terms are followed. Now, Creative Commons has four broad licensing conditions. You may have seen these particular round logos in different places and on different documents. And here are the four like circle logos that we have here. When you see the picture of just a person, like not quite a stick figure, but just like a person in a circle, this is known as the attribution conditioning license. Uh, the logo shows it's a Creative Commons attribution list license where the condition is that credit is given to a creator. Then you have the second one. It's kind of like a reverse C with an arrow on it in a middle of a circle, and that's known as the share alike license. Whenever someone attaches that kind of license to their work, it means that changes must be distributed with the same license as its original work. So it means, yes, you could use it and you could share it as long as you share it with other people the same way they shared the work with you. The third licensing condition is a circle with a dollar sign, but with a slash mark in the middle of it, and that means non commercial. And that's a condition that means that a work can be used as long as they're not for commercial purposes and if they're not for profit. And then finally, you have an equal sign surrounded by a circle. This is known as no derivatives. And this means that new versions cannot be released. I have a picture of my dog at the end. I have a beloved miniature dachshund. And if I put a Creative Commons license on it, but didn't want anyone to change it, I didn't want anyone to put sunglasses on the dog or a tiara on the dog or make it set on the moon instead of the keys, which is what the picture is. I could say CC-ND, Creative Commons license. Anyone could use it, but ND, no derivatives, but you can't do funny stuff to my picture. That's a condition, for instance, to give an example. So those are the four common licensing conditions that are out there, but they could be used in different combinations, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So Creative Commons has six very common licensing types and combinations. So I mentioned the CC BY, that's the Creative Commons attribution. So there on the left, you've got the CC logo and the person in the circle logo. And then in like the third column, you got the letters CCBY. So that means attribution. If you see a journal article or a picture and it's got that tag on it that the creator put to it, then you could use it. Just send them love and give them the attribution. Then the second common Creative Commons license type is called Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike, and that's signified by CC BY-SA. So here you're telling people that other people can use your work if they attribute you and if they share it the way you've shared it. And then you've got the third one, CC BY-NC. So that means Creative Commons Attribution and non-commercial purposes. Uh, I notice that a lot of people will use that if they want they don't want their work used like in a book, or maybe they don't want it to be used for commercial purposes. They really want their work to be free and openly available. They might tag on that non-commercial tag to their work. Okay, here they become a little bit more complicated in a way. Um, People still have the right to use them in different ways, but here you may see a few more restrictions. So here we've got the CC BY attribution, say who it is, followed by NC non-commercial, can't be used for profit, and then share alike SA. Then the fifth one you got is the Creative Commons BY no derivatives. So share it, attribute it, but you can't do anything too radically different with it. And then the more restrictive of all the Creative Commons licenses may be the CC, BY, NC, and D. That is Creative Commons with attribution, non-commercial, and no derivatives. So notice how they got from short CC, BY to a little bit longer. Um, but a lot of authors have different reasons and creators have different reasons for doing that, and that's what's nice about Creative Commons licenses. They have a lot of flexibility. You all can do the same with your um, instructional works if you want to, or any other work where you do possess the copyright. So Creative Commons licenses are used not only for teaching and instruction, but they could also be used for your publishing purposes too.
Yeah, I'm always curious about like when I make PowerPoints and whatnot. So I don't know if you're going to get into that later, but maybe good resources because I don't like generic clip art, as all the time, but like good resources to get, pictures. And also, do we need to, have reference pages at the end? If you could just steer me towards information on that, if you have that, I would greatly appreciate it.
Sure. At the end, I do have some web pages where you can go, where you
Perfect.
can find Creative Commons, clip
Okay.
art, images, and things like that. And they're pretty good about telling what you can and cannot do with them or what the conditions
Okay.
may be of their use. Some, especially if they're in the public domain, you don't have to make any attribution at all, but whenever I use
Hmm.
public domain work, I sometimes I do just to be a good sport, and then I'll tack public domain image, for
Okay.
instance. So,
Yeah,
Oh,
and we have another question too, Christy.
okay.
Veronica Diaz, do we need to include the icons, which you have on the far left on this slide, or can just the what you have in parentheses on the right-hand side be sufficient?
What one of the Creative Commons is actually an organization too, and one of the things they do recommend is have one or the other. One or the other will be fine. You don't necessarily have to have both. And one thing that you can also do too is you could add an active link into it so that if someone sees, say, the CCBYND, you could embed a link in that and then they can see exactly what that means and read a web page that explains the license and what a person can and probably should not do. I do get some interesting questions about do you have to include stuff like this in the references? And it's rare for me to see these types of things within a references cited or a bibliography, but where I usually do see these licenses will be like maybe under directly underneath where it occurs. Like if someone uses a picture, they might like cite the source and then tag the license right there, but not necessarily put them in the not put the license in the bibliography or the references cited. But I think one way or another, as long as it shows up somewhere, it's good practice for it. Because really, there's not really a standardized way to do that quite yet. That's still something they're working on, I think, or need to discuss. But okay, so here's to give you an example. We just wrapped up Hispanic Heritage Month, and I just had this fictitious scenario. Let's just say somebody's doing a display case and they want to use some images they find on Flickr for that. So take a look at this slide here, and you've got this postcard titled Hispanic Americans, Colonel J.R. Vargas Jr. Take a look at this page and identify the Creative Commons license attached to the image. Okay, so in the red, It says CCBY, attribution required. So if you're able to go onto the Flickr page, you could select that link that says some rights reserved, and it goes to the Creative Commons attribution license. And then here, as you can see, it's got the little circle with the person in the inside of it. So this is a particular work on Flickr where the USMC archives allows it to be reused as long as you attribute it. So if you were to use this particular thing for a display case, I think it would be okay just as long as you say it's the USMC archives and maybe provide a link in the license to to this particular document that you wanted to reuse. Let's see. So here I asked, what are some possible ways to use this while following the licensing terms? What are some things that you think we'd be able to do with this particular image for instructional purposes? What are some things that we could do? Well, people always ask me about PowerPoint images, and I think they images for PowerPoint. So yes, Robin, thank you. Yep, you could use it. Someone could use it in PowerPoint if they wanted to for their teaching purposes. They could probably download the file too, and as long as they have attribution. If they'd rather just instead of linking out to it, put it in the download the image and put it in your Canvas if you wanted to. Oh, and you know what else you could do with this? Going for a research purpose or a creative purpose. You could probably use this in a collage as long as you give the USMC archives attribution. If you're writing a book, say about Hispanic American veterans, you could probably use this in your book too, because it has a Creative Commons BY license attached to it by the creator. If you wish to use this in your scholarly publication, you can without copyright, without asking for copyright permissions because the copyright holder had attached this license to the image. So there's a lot of things that the Creative Commons licenses can allow you to do. Let's see. And Veronica asked in chat, including the word you have source and place it below the image and use it in an infographic. Yes, that's also correct too. Yes, absolutely. In the yellow section on the right, I have a hyperlink to Flickr, and it's asked if it's needed. I guess the answer to that is how complete do I want it to be? I have the name of the creator, the date, the title. I included the link just so other people can get to it directly if they wanted to. I decided to go the more full route with the attribution, but I think some people could say as long as I put USMC archives, Hispanic Americans, that was game. There is but I do know that Creative Commons does recommend putting the link to the actual source when attributing. It's not necessarily required. I don't think anyone's going to go after you if you don't, but at the minimum, I'd say the author and the title. And if you want to go max, sure, the URL is not a bad idea either. But in this particular example, this is for a book that had a Creative Commons license. And here I ask you all to take a look at the website for a book. It's copyrighted, but the author and the publisher put Creative Commons license to it. This particular one had a Creative Commons BY and D license. Um, Now, one thing that I wanted to let you all know is that there's really not a standard way where the create or place on a document or a page or anything like that where a Creative Commons license may be attached. So sometimes you may have to look around a little bit to see if there is a Creative Commons license attached to a work. So you might have to look at the beginning, the end, the verso or the information about a document. So I wish they could be more standardized about where they would put a Creative Commons license, but you do have to look around a little bit on a page. All right, the second kind of label for materials that you could use is known as open access. We are in open access week, and at the end, I'll give a not so shameless plug about some open access activities the library will be having this week. But to let you know what it is, if you don't get a chance to go to it is a publishing or distribution model that allows free, unrestricted, and often online versions of various works and publications. So this means instead of having a subscription or having to go through a paywall, you should be able to look at some materials if they have the open access model. Open access materials can include journals, books, They could also include data too and other types of work. And the intent behind the open access model is to allow readers to have unmediated and free access to materials. So people will purposefully put their work online, and publishers can do this too, and say, you can look at our work, and we don't have a paywall, and you don't necessarily need a subscription. So, open access works like Creative Commons works will have some sort of logo, statement, or label somewhere on the document. So, in this particular article I have here from Frontiers in Sociology titled Poverty and COVID 19, in the left margin, they do indicate that it is an open access work. I did include the DOI so you can go directly to the article and see how they did that. And they also have an open access statement and Creative Commons license attached to it. Now, open access utilizes Creative Commons licenses to allow sharing and reuse. So, open access and Creative Commons are very hand in hand. And as I mentioned before, the intent for an open access license is to provide readers direct and cost free access to materials. This isn't really just done for journal articles and journals. We also have more and more books that are published with an open access model. Like this crowd, Ethnographic Encounters has a open padlock, which is the kind of like the universal logo for open access. Now, one thing about open access is that it does have three models, and with the three models, it sometimes you'll have different versions of a work available based on the three models, and it's just one little kind of quirk about open access I wanted to tell you. Now, gold and hybrid open access models have the finalized versions of record. That's kind of like the official version of a document or an article or some sort of artifact that you may want to look at. But the green open access article is kind of more wide open. You may see some preprints, which is an early version of a work, and there may or may not be some significant changes after the peer review. It may not have undergone peer review yet. Now, some green open access may provide the accepted manuscript where you got the version of the work with the changes after the peer review, but it's not quite the final version. Or sometimes it may have the version of record or the final published work. And sometimes authors may have a permission to self archive their final version of work. This depends on the publisher, but my whole point, not to confuse you so much, I hope I didn't, is that the gold version of open access and the hybrid version of open access is usually where you'll get the final version of a work. So the question may come up, how can you tell if a work is open access? And the quickest thing I could say is check the label or look for the label. It's kind of similar to a Creative Commons publication where you look at the publication information, or you can take a look at an about page if it's a journal or a book, or what they call the book verso, which is usually the probably like one of the first pages where you have the author information, the publishing information, and call numbers and stuff like that. Then somewhere on the work, you should see a Creative Commons license or statement along with an open access logo. And then you might also have watermarks or other kinds of indicators on the publication, which I'll show in the next slide. Going back to that open access having three common models, one of the things that I've met some professors who like to use open access journals because they don't have a paywall and people could usually get to them quickly. However, sometimes, especially the green open access model, you may have the author manuscript, which I have in this example, Nursing Care for Hospitalized Older Adults. It's indicated on this particular version that this is the author manuscript. A nursing professor had seen this particular article and asked if this would be acceptable to be used in for as for the teaching purposes. And I'd asked them if they really needed the final version or if a manuscript was acceptable. They thought it over and they thought, no, they were just introducing the students to scholarly communication and how articles may look and what they can expect to find. So they really didn't need that final version necessarily. This was more like an exercise for their students to get acquainted with reading journals, which they probably hadn't read much before simply because they hadn't been exposed to them. So definitely consider if a final version is necessary or optional. And this is going to depend on your teaching and learning objectives. So it's up to you and what you really want to do with your students with an open access work. Then finally, we'll talk about public domain. And public domain is work that is free of copyright protection. Now, copyright is not forever, although a lot of activists feel like it is in America, but some creators will actually dedicate their work to the public domain. So rather than waiting for a copyright to expire and its legal protection, some people will say, no, I want this work to be freely and openly available, and people can do whatever they want with it. Public domain works can be freely used, repurposed, and redistributed. Like, for instance, the image of the immigrant family that I used at Ellis Island, for instance, I don't really, there really are no restrictions on what I could do with that. And then copyrighted work, which falls into the public domain, can range from images, but it could also include sound, like music, data, multimedia. A lot of Charlie Chaplin's early films are in the public domain now. And then, of course, it could use text. So, what qualifies as a public domain work? Well, there is a particular Creative Commons logo that means public domain. This is known as CC0, Creative Commons zero. Zero protections over a work. And they may have the circle with the C crossed out or just a circle with a zero. So whenever you see works that have these two logos, you can be confident that it's probably going to be a public domain work and work that could be used freely and openly. Most government works and reports can also be in the public domain, like this Dietary Guidelines for Americans 2020 to 2025. It's a report by the USDA about healthy eating guidelines that it established. This is actually a public domain work, but definitely check the details within a government document or report to verify that it is public domain, because there is a handful of types of work that are not, but most are. Works that were published or created 95 years ago or more will be in the public domain. Like I mentioned, The Great Gatsby, for instance, and Charlie Chaplin's early films. Now, there are guides on the internet that will help you determine if a work is in the public domain. It will depend on the kind of work, because of the many changes in copyright law. Some works will have more like or longer copyright terms than other works. But the Cornell University Library has a really good spread, like a table, to help you determine that, titled Copyright Term and the Public Domain. So if you have a particular work, you have the year, you can take a look at its table and determine if a work is in the public domain. So, some best practices for using Creative Commons open access and public domain works are as follows. I would really pay attention to the license coherence, that is, you want to check the label for the licenses and terms to be sure it follows your intended use. One thing that you may want to do, especially if you use open access works, is to review the version, if it's the preprint or a manuscript, or if it's going to be the very final version of work, and make sure it aligns with your teaching objectives. You can also add durable URLs to your syllabi or your learning management system too, for people to access it. You could usually download or save the work as if possible too, especially if people may have limited bandwidth or something like that. And instead of just sending them a URL, you put the file into Canvas and they could get it that way possibly. And then attribution is always good practice too, whether it's the Creative Commons labeling, including the link, or just letting people know where you got the particular item and what kind of license is attached to it. I do have some research guides available that can help you find these works. I do have a Creative Commons research guide where you can find things like Openverse. It has links to Creative Commons works ranging from documents to images. It even has a link to free music archives if you need even background music for a presentation you're doing or something like that, that do have Creative Commons permissions. I actually use those on some tutorials that I created. Then we have the Open Access Research Guide. It has a link to the directory of open access journals and the directory of open access books if you're interested in finding open access materials for reading for your courses. And then we do have a public domain research guide that links out to Internet Archive. That's a really good source of public domain works along with the Digital Public Library of America. And then my shameless plug. If you're free tomorrow at noon, you could learn more about open access. You could register at this link, but I will introduce open access, its models, and how you could use it a little more. This will be an emphasis completely on open access. And then my second open access webinar will be open access models and paying for it. So we'll talk about if you're interested in publishing in open access, how you could do that, and also an agreement with the um, Cambridge University Press. If you're a state university employee, student, faculty, anything like that, and you have a manuscript you want to publish in a Cambridge University Press, you can do it open access thanks to an agreement that Cambridge University Press entered with the FAU. And it doesn't just include you all, it could also include students too who may be interested in publishing in an article. So that's going to be Wednesday also at noon for our International Open Access Week. If you'd like more information, this is the Scholarly Communications webpage where you can get more information about the services offered by the scholarly communication within the FAU libraries. We could do presentations like this for your group, for yourself, or your class, or however you see fit. And this is my pup, Marley. She likes the keys, so it's a very dog-friendly place. And we went there last April, and as you could see, she was having a smashingly good time. If we found a chart, for instance, on a Google search, included it in a white paper, can we include that in a lecture PowerPoint with attribution? Of course, the lectures are only available to students. The first thing I would recommend for something like that is to check the license. So if he found a chart on Google and he can see the full document that it appeared on, I would check if there's a Creative Commons or open access mark on it somewhere that allows that use. That's the first step. The second step, if it doesn't have any of those types of uses, you might need to evaluate the fair use of it. Fair use is a copyright exception. You could use copyrighted things for limited purposes, but it depends on the details. There's definitely been some instances of fair use where people were able to do that. And Dr. Huang, I see that the lectures are only available to students. That's a factor that may help a fair use analysis too. Um, but yeah, that's a big question though. But fair use is what you'd have to consider about whether or not to use that. I just added the fair use link into the chat, so you could go to that if you'd like and read more about fair use and how you could make that kind of a determination. Now, I don't mean to scare people about fair use or anything like that, but I guess if I could make a suggestion about it, it's a good idea to know what it is, what falls in favor of fair use, and then you could think about it. And you could think about your own risk assessment. Some people, just like Judy had said, they choose not to do such a thing, but some people with a different risk tolerance and the details may say, it's okay, I don't think I'm committing infringement, but that depends on your interpretation of the details. So, for instance, the Library of Congress has a lot of information, a lot of public domain documents in there. Unsplash is something that I've used a lot. Pixabay is another one too. Yeah, Creative Commons is open archives, has a lot of links to sites where you could use that openly and freely too. And then we do have an images library guide that links out to places where you can get stock photos and other things for that. So yeah, Lori had mentioned the images guide for recommended image repositories. And then I know that Art Store is a source that we have if you're into fine arts and things like that. Um, they do have a lot of images that do allow uses for instructional and teaching purposes too. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming in today. Thank you, Judy and Kosi, for having us
Thank
here. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It is, as always, our pleasure. Thanks so much.